Today I'm going to talk about how to value privately held companies, media companies in particular. But first I have a question for the audience. I'd like to know how many of you feel like you have some broad idea of how much the business that you work for or that you own or lead is worth. Okay, we got a couple of hands. That's great. You're very much in the minority, though. I'll tell you that most of the folks that work in companies actually have no idea what their business is worth. They don't do the work to figure out what the business is worth. Instead, what they do is they rely on conjecture, things that they'll hear at conference cocktail parties. Like at this conference, somebody may say, hey, I heard that Politico sold for 15 times EBITDA, so your business is probably worth 15 times EBITDA. That's probably not the case, but it's fun to kind of think that way, and a lot of people certainly do. In the next 15 minutes, we're going to talk about the need to know how much your business is worth and how to find out how much it's worth. The CEOs of public companies know exactly how much their companies are worth because every day the stock market's giving them a report. That's not the case with private companies. Private companies could use this information, but they don't have it at hand. If they did, they would be making much better decisions about their companies. Monitoring revenue and EBITDA is not enough. That's what most companies do. They focus just on how we're doing in terms of revenue and EBITDA growth. But what you must know is how much value you're creating every year. Let me give you an example of why that's the case based on a recent transaction I worked on in the United States. The company I sold had 3 different businesses that were all in different industries. 2 of the businesses were good businesses with they were in industries with high multiples. And then there was a declining business, and you can guess that it was a magazine business, a print business, that was declining and in a low multiple industry. 2 years before I was hired, the CEO of this company was focused on fixing the bad business, and he spent most of his time doing that. He made some improvements, but not a lot, and when we went to sell the business, the 2 good businesses sold for in excess of 10 times EBITDA, which is a very good price, and the declining business sold for only 4 times. The mistake that the CEO made was not realizing that there were different valuations for different businesses. So instead of putting the focus on the good businesses, where for every $1 million he increased EBITDA, he increased value by $10 million, he focused on the bad businesses. If he had known before he embarked on his turnaround strategy about the value of the 3 different businesses, I think he might have made a different decision. Valuation is the best prism through which to examine all of the qualities of your business. It really opens your eyes to the strengths and weaknesses. Let's talk about how you create a valuation. The traditional way is to hire an outside expert. There are 3 groups that are typically hired for this work: a valuation appraiser, an accountant, or an investment banker. All 3 have the tools necessary to do the work to give you a value of what your company is worth. And when we do this work, and I do it as an investment banker, it's typically using 3 different methods of valuation and then triangulating the value by saying, well, we use these 3 methods, and so here in the middle is where the value of this company is. That's a way of kind of covering your ass if you're the advisor. And that's important because generally when you're doing this kind of work, it is for a purpose. It may be that one of the founders of the business passed away and the estate wants the business valued so that they can get paid out. It could be that you're going to borrow money from a bank, and the bank wants to know what the business is worth before they'll lend the money to you. To do all that work, you have to have a third party doing the work of appraising the business so that it's believable to both the heirs of the deceased founder and the banks. And the most common method used in valuation is called discounted cash flow. What that means is you have to have future projections for the business out 3 to 5 years. You then look at the cash derived from the business over that time period, and you bring it kind of back to the present value, and that tells you what the business is worth today. So that today's value is based on what you're going to be able to do in the future. I have a problem with this methodology in that the valuation is only as good as your ability to project. And most companies are not very good at projecting. I've worked with clients where they've done 3-year projections, and I've looked 3 years later at how they performed, and it doesn't look anything like what they projected. That's pretty common, and that's why I think the discounted cash flow methodology is not the best methodology to use when you're trying to establish the value of a company. But CEOs don't spend a lot of time preparing valuations on a regular basis. The reasons are because it's expensive. You're paying for those third-party advisors. It's complicated. They're asking you to do a lot of work. And it's also time-consuming. You're having to teach the business to those third-party advisors. So I've come up with a new approach to valuation, and I've put it in a book called Quick Value. I have a copy here. But this new valuation method allows you to look under the hood for yourself. You can use your own staff, and you can avoid the need for financial projections. You don't need the projections out 3 to 5 years. I've dismissed that methodology from my method. This is Quick Value, and we're going to talk now about how to discover your value in 3 steps. Step 1 is find and rate your value drivers. Value drivers are the things that make your business unique and define your business. For example, you may have a patent, and if you have something like that, it's got value on its own, and it contributes value to the overall business. It makes your company attractive, and a reason why somebody would buy your business and perhaps pay more than what they would for other companies. Or you have recurring revenue. If you have recurring revenue, that's also considered a plus. There are certainly things that might be a minus, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. But what you do next is you pick the 8 to 12 value drivers out of 45 that I list in the book, and those 8 to 12 are the ones that best represent your business. If you're looking at, if you were thinking about buying your own business, which things would you look at and consider to be the most important, and how would you rate on yourselves on those? So that's the exercise here. Here are some of the 45 value drivers. I'll talk about a couple of them by way of example. Revenue stability. We have a client right now. We're selling the company, and it's an ad agency. We're running into problems because the earnings are very choppy and the revenues are choppy because they go up and down as they add clients. So the buyers are having a hard time valuing that business. So revenue stability is golden when it comes to buyers saying, you know, I value this business highly, it's an attractive business. If you don't have that, there's concern on the part of buyers and how they value your business. Barriers to entry, you know, are you positioned in a way that it would be hard to compete with you? Leadership, I have a quick example. We sold a company 2 years ago, Purpose, that had a CEO, Jeremy Hymans, who's actually still with the company. He'd written a book called New Power that was one of the 5 best books selected by the Financial Times in that particular year. Jeremy, because of the book and because of his personality, had access to Fortune 500 CEOs. So he was constantly traveling and meeting with these CEOs. When we sold the company, that was a very attractive capability that the company had. Ultimately, Capgemini bought this company, but there were 10 other groups that were very interested, and that gives you kind of a feel for why. And then one more example is customer diversity. We've had cases where we sold companies and the revenue would come from just one source. In this example, it was Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble made up 60% of the revenue of our client. That made the company very hard to sell. We ultimately sold it to a company, it was actually WPP, that was very comfortable with that because Procter & Gamble was their largest client, so it worked out. But it was very challenging because what happens is buyers say, well, if you lose that one account, Procter & Gamble, you no longer have a business. I mean, you just lost all of your revenue. So how can I possibly put a value on that? That's exactly how people think about it, and that's how you should be thinking about your business when you're valuing it. Then you rate your value drivers on a score of 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 the highest. And again, it's important here to be objective. You should be thinking about, well, the best thing you can do, I would say, is make sure you have 3 or 4 people doing this work on your team, so it's not just one person. You get a better result in terms of being objective. If you, in this example, had 10 value drivers, and the potential score is 10 for each, that means you have a score of 100. If you end up with 80, that's a very high score, and that's excellent. If you end up with 20%, that would be not so good, but also had plenty of room to improve on. Next, you determine your valuation range, and this will be as a multiple of either EBITDA or revenue. In most cases, it's going to be EBITDA. There are a few cases where, particularly in industries like software as a service, where revenue is the driver in terms of being the multiple. And we do hear stories about businesses in the SaaS area being sold for 20 times EBIT, 20 times revenue, which is pretty astounding. So then next you would, what you would do is you'd select 15 public companies that are similar to yours and in the same industry, and you'd rank their multiples from highest to lowest. That would help you secure the range in which you should be able to find your value. You may need to make, and you probably will need to make, an adjustment for private M&A transactions. That's because private M&A transactions typically trade at lower multiples than public companies. The average is about 30% lower. But we use public companies as the barometer because it's easy to get that information. Also, the information is very fresh and current, whereas if you have to rely on private transactions, there may have only been 3 in your industry in the past year and 3 the year before, and you have to pull in old information. So that makes that data less valuable than it would otherwise be. And now, after you've gone through those 2 steps, you're ready to calculate your value. I'm going to show you how to do it. In this case, what you would do is you would apply your value driver score. I'm using 30% as in this example, against your EBITDA range. Your EBITDA range here is 6.5 at the low end to 11.1. So you can see that 30% is not a great score, but it gives you a multiple of just under 8 times. If you were in the 80 to 90 percentile, you would have an EBITDA multiple of 10.2 to 10.6 times. Obviously, doing the work to improve the business and get to that level would make a lot of sense. The moment of truth now is taking your, in this example, EBITDA of 10 million, your value driver score of 30%, applying the 30% to the 6.5 to 11 gives you a multiple of 7.9 times EBITDA. That times the 10 million gives you your value of 10 million. And now I'm just going to talk for a minute about the ways you can use this information to improve your business. First of all, low-scoring value drivers aren't necessarily a bad thing. That gives you something to plan for over the next year. How can we increase those scores on our value drivers, the areas where we're not performing as well as we should be, and develop a plan and a strategy to do that. That helps you increase your value when you do the valuation a year later. The second is you can reward your team based on value creation, not just simply revenue and EBITDA. What's more important than, in the case of the company that I mentioned earlier, they had businesses that performing really well and making a lot of money, businesses that were not making a lot of money. But they were basing their bonuses on revenue growth. And so if they even grew by a little bit, everybody got a bonus, even though the value of the business was, in general, on a decline, and they weren't aware of that. Next, you can plan for a sale and pick the time that'll be optimal because you know what your value is. And then finally, you can respond decisively to an unsolicited offer. And that certainly happens in our business. I'm going to give you a quick example of another client I worked with. 8 years ago, this magazine client received a very attractive offer for their business at a premium price. If they'd asked me at the time, which they didn't, I would have said, take the price. You're never going to see a price that good again for a magazine business. Instead, the founder decided to focus on a digital strategy. Unlike the example we heard earlier from the New York Times, even though his daughter was driving digital and had worked in Silicon Valley, the digital strategy didn't work out so well. They invested $10 million and put all their efforts against that and really took their eye off the ball on the print business. What happened next, when I did get involved, was trying to keep the company from going into bankruptcy. And the lesson here was really to monitor your value on a regular basis so that you can take corrective action. And the takeaways are that I hope in this discussion I've been able to convince you to measure the value of your business. Do it at least once a year and use whichever method is available to you. If it's the traditional method, use that. If it's quick value, use that. Just make sure you do it, because I've seen too many companies that have lost tremendous value simply by not realizing what their value was. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time.